I just want to do God's will.
The kind of revolution that the world needs is a Christian revolution.
If you want a miracle, you've got to expect it to happen.
You're the recipients of God's grace and God's blessings, and you rejoice in that reality.
Welcome to Life Today Live. I'm Randy Robinson. It's good to have you here. How's your new year? Were the holidays stressful for you? Hopefully you can take some time to reassess and maybe put some things in perspective. We're going to try to help you do that because, you know, it's interesting. I was talking to a medical doctor recently on the broadcast program, and it's amazing how many of our physical issues are due to stress and hypertension and high blood pressure, all the things that result from our bodies responding by, you know, kicking in, I don't know all the technical stuff, kicking in whatever it kicks in that happens when we're stressed. Well, okay, what causes the stress and what leads to the fatigue and the burnout? We're going to talk about some of those issues because those are very important. And you know what? When you understand these things, you can take control, and it will not only impact you mentally, I think spiritually, and a lot of times that's the root, but also physically. So there's a lot going on, and we're going to unpack some of those things today. My guest has a book out now called Stress Fracture. It's written by Jonathan Hoover, and he's a senior associate pastor at New Spring Church in Wichita, Kansas, as well as an assistant professor at Regent University in their School of Psychology and Counseling. In fact, he is the director of the Master of Science in Psychology program. I say all that to say he knows what he's talking about. Dr. Hoover, welcome to Life Today Live.
It's a joy to be on the show. Thank you so much for having me.
So what's interesting is, you know, when you talk about, okay, counseling, psychology, and there's a lot of different directions you could go with this, but you've chosen to address this in a book, which I understand means time, effort, research. Why is this such a big issue for you?
It started with just a personal experience for me. My dad has been the pastor of the church where I serve now for almost 40 years. This next year will be his 40th year there. And I came on staff 14 years ago. And my dad has always been the adult in the room. I don't know if you know somebody like that, but he's just the most emotionally stable person and kind of the leader who always has a plan, even when things are going crazy. And I'd watched him weather some just incredibly stressful seasons as a pastor, relocating across town, and then a huge transition in just how we did ministry. And when I came on board, the church had been growing by about 1,000 a year, and people looked at my dad as just one of those leaders who has that it factor of just knowing what to do and how to do it. And again, for me, he was just my rock because he was so just emotionally strong and stable. And about 6 or 7 months after I came on staff, there were just a few things that I think of as kind of like last straw things that happened for him stress-wise. One was the leaving of a key staff member that went to a different role and or to a different job. And there's something inside of him snapped, and suddenly he wasn't okay. He went from being the person I'd known my whole life who was always okay to being not okay. And he was concerned he was dying. I mean, absolutely convinced he was dying. And he was weepy one moment, anxious the next moment, never seen him like this, questioning whether God had ever used him. And I mean, this is at a time when the church is just exploding in growth. And he's like, yeah, I don't think God's ever used me. And we're just going, what in the world is happening to him? And, you know, we got him help. It was a crazy season for me because I'd just come on staff. And so for the next 6 weeks, I was filling in for my dad. It was the Christmas season. It was actually this time of year. I was filling in for him. And I remember thinking to myself, because I had just started going back to school to study psychology back then. Again, this is 14 years ago. And I thought to myself, I want to understand this because we did get him help. And within 6 to 8 weeks, he was back. And I would say he's been better than ever over the last 14 years. But nobody could exactly tell him what it was he was going through. The closest we could get to it was, hey, you're depressed. And I think he certainly was by then. But I kind of promised myself when he was going through that, I want to figure out what this is, and I would love to be able to help people who are going through what he's going through. And so when I wrote this book, and it took me 10 years of research to write this book, when I wrote it, I wanted to write the book that I wish we could have given my dad when he was going through this. And so that was the passion and the drive. But the cool thing I found out was it wasn't just my dad. I found out this happens to so many people. It happened to Walt Disney. He got to a point where he couldn't be on the phone without crying. Happened to Charlie Chaplin, who dove out of a second-story window because he was burned out and thought he would never be able to be creative again. It happened to Mike Wallace, who tried to take his own life in 1984 during a stressful season. It's a common thing. We just don't talk about it, that in this world that pushes us to believe we're infinite, that there is a moment where we push ourselves too far, and even the strongest people can really hit a point of weakness when that happens.
What do you? Okay, there's probably not one set answer to this, but is there something going on mentally that is impacting emotionally, or vice versa, that then becomes a physical issue? Because for me, the hard part, I mean, I recognize, I'm an Oral Roberts University grad where they teach body, mind, spirit, and I do believe in that we are whole and we should address ourselves in a holistic manner. But sometimes I don't know if I got the cart before the horse. I'm like, is this a spiritual problem that's resulting in this emotional stress, which is causing the physical issues, or is there something physically out of whack, and you need to start there? How do you know where to go with that?
I believe it's a holistic problem. I feel like burnout happens because we treat our finite selves like infinite selves, and then there are multiple parts of your life that will begin to tell you you're in trouble. So your physical body will tell you you're in trouble.
Yeah.
It will tell you you're pushing me too hard.
Yeah.
Your emotions will start to let you know you're in trouble because you will not be emotionally how you normally are. And people around you will especially notice that. People around you will start to go, "Are you okay? You don't seem like yourself."
Yeah.
And you start to get that kind of feedback. Relationships will let you know you're in trouble because you'll start to see relationships that were doing really well that start to seem kind of flat. And I mean, even in your spiritual life, where you used to feel passion to engage with God, it starts to feel kind of hollow and empty. And sometimes there can be even those spiritual doubts like my dad was dealing with. So I feel like at the core of it is this temptation to treat our finite selves as though we're infinite. We just push ourselves too hard for too long. That's the formula for burnout. If you want to know how do you get burned out, you push yourself too hard for too long. But when you do that, you're going to start to pay a price in all of these other arenas of life. The interesting thing physically is how, and I don't think we knew this until maybe the past 15, 20 years, is how many things in your body stress can impact.
Yeah.
Because we thought about it as a cardiovascular problem. We knew for decades that it could affect your blood pressure, your heart health, all that. But we didn't know how big a deal it was with, for instance, your ability to heal, with your immune system. I mean, pick up a medical manual and look up all the different things that end in itis. Things that end in itis are bodily inflammation problems. And what we know is that stress can amp up bodily inflammation. So the truth is, your medical manuals are saturated with things that can happen to you based off of stress. And we don't want to hear that because it would be easier if it was something we could take a medication for and just be fine. When the solution is to back off on stress, that's a hard one to hear. And yet it is something that Jesus taught his followers to do. Look at when Jesus had to talk with Martha. There are moments when our relationship with God, we have to hit that wall of realizing I have to back up a little bit.
Okay, so you touched on something that's with a lot of people is like a big deal, and that's the medication. And a friend of mine, former roommate of mine, is a doctor, and he, we've talked, and he says that doctors are quick to sort of write a script for a problem. And when you're looking at it strictly from a physical aspect, and you see inflammation, well, you go, okay, take this pill, it'll reduce the inflammation. How do you view the role of medication in dealing with stress?
Okay, well,
I know, right?
So I'm very positive about well thought out, strategically prescribed and strategically monitored, and that last bit is really important. Prescriptions for things that are the outcome of stress. So like bodily, there's no question that if I'm going through something physiologically, like some sort of inflammation in my body, and there's a medication I can take that will help with that, that makes perfect sense to me. But I will say it would not make sense to do that and also ignore the stress that I'm going through that may be triggering that inflammation. Yeah. More complicated are questions like, all right, well, I'm depressed. And by the way, burnout is a path to depression. When I was originally studying psychology years and years ago, we were taught that depression was mostly a genetic thing. And there is a genetic part of depression. But We now know there are certain things that you can do in life that will take you down the road and you will end up at depression. And burnout is one of those. Burnout will take you down the road to depression. Now, if you get there, it's very likely that someone is going to suggest something like an SSRI. Well, I personally am very much for these medications. They're low risk, they're low dose, they have very good success rates. So I don't think that's a problem. What I do think is, though, it is a problem if we don't also look at to take the other approach of additionally saying what could be contributing to this depression that also needs to be changed in this person's lifestyle. Yeah. So for me, and maybe this sounds like a cop-out, for me it's a both and. I'm not opposed at all to medications that can help in the short term and specifically help with the presenting symptoms. What I don't like is when we just do that and we don't also look at what could also be precipitating this problem, that there needs to be some lifestyle changes that could help.
So there could be some benefits from something that will deal with the physiological, but you got to get to the root of what's causing it in the first place, is what I hear you saying.
Absolutely.
And that makes sense. Okay, so you mentioned some of these sort of red flags, the feelings that we might experience, the feelings of failure and the questioning, the relationship suffering, the enthusiasm waning. If someone is experiencing some of those types of symptoms and they're like, okay, yeah, I can relate to that, where do they go?
Well, so the first thing to do, if you think that you're experiencing burnout, or if you're, like, let's say it's a loved one and you're concerned for them, I am always about making 3 appointments. So if it's making 3 appointments for yourself or encouraging them to make 3 appointments for themselves. And this kind of goes to what you were talking about with the ORU model. This is sort of the body, soul, spirit model. First appointment is with your doctor. So you need to go make an appointment with your PCP. Go talk to them about what you're experiencing. Talk to them about your stress, and then also talk to them about any bodily symptoms that you're experiencing, right? Now, here's the thing too. I find, and this is anecdotal, not research-based, but I think that very charismatic, productive, forward-leaning people are the most likely to be burned out sometimes. And I worry when I send them to the doctor that they're used to just having fun with the doctor and let's talk about the Super Bowl and all the stuff that's coming up. Like, you have to not do that. This is an appointment where you're going to get, make sure that your doctor knows what you're experiencing, what you're feeling, what you're going through. Let them help you. Second appointment is with a counselor. And I mean a professional counselor, a therapist. And you're going to talk to them about what you're feeling, what you're going through, and kind of talk with them about the different stressors that you're dealing with, because sometimes the stressors we're dealing with are things we can do something about, and your therapist can help you think about some productive ways of scaling them back. Other times they're things we can't get rid of or offload, but we need to work through trying to feel differently about them. That's what your therapist is trained to help you do. And then the third appointment is with a spiritual advisor. That could be your pastor. But I work with a lot of pastors, and they need a spiritual advisor.
Right.
And so we got to hook them up with somebody that can help be a spiritual influence in their life for good. And so those three appointments, for me, that's ground zero of dealing with, I feel like I'm burning out. That's my first advice to anyone going through it, is put those appointments on the calendar, do them as quickly as you can. You will at least get next steps. I mean, I hope that a book like mine will give you a lot of next steps, but they will be able to triage exactly what you're specifically going through and give you some next steps.
All right. The book we're talking about is Stress Fracture by Dr. Jonathan Hoover. It's available where you get books. You can also go to the website for the book, which is stressfracturebook.com. And if you're experiencing some of these, or you have a loved one who's experiencing some of these things, this would be a real good resource for you. It's going to, like he says, give you some next steps, give you some place to go. Because I think a lot of times, one of the biggest barriers is not knowing what to do with it, especially for a pastor who feels like he can't admit failure. But, it's beyond just pastors. But what are some of the reasons you see that people don't deal with this properly? I mean, I can imagine a few off the top of my head, just having seen it, around me, or maybe experiencing a little bit myself. But what are some of the sort of the attitudinal barriers that we have to break down? Pride might be a big one. I don't know. What do you see?
Yeah. So there's so many things. One is lack of awareness, and almost a resistance to awareness. So when you start to burn out, people around you will notice, and they'll say stuff. And the funny thing that I notice, and this is just, again, anecdotal, but I think those of us that want to be so productive, we want to be so productive, and especially sometimes if we grew up in a performance-based environment of some sort, and we feel like we have to perform in order to be accepted or loved, I feel like what happens is we almost wear those warnings as a badge of honor. People think I'm pushing too hard, and it's almost like that's how I know I'm doing okay. People think people think I'm going way too far, and that's my pat on the back. If they didn't think I was pushing too hard, I'd be failing. So there's that. There's a Christian sappy weird belief that this is separate from what I was just talking about, that if I focus on myself and try to be aware of what's going on in myself, that is selfish. And I really like to use this illustration because there's a big difference between self-awareness and self-absorption. So when my wife and I went on a cruise, I don't know, this 12 or 13 years ago, and we were on this Carnival boat, and there was the bridge, and the captain's or I guess you call it a captain, walking back and forth on the bridge. It was glass so you could see, always with the binoculars, looking out at the ocean. That is being ocean aware. And I expect that from the captain of the ship. If he wasn't, that would be a problem for me. Yeah. Now, if the captain was over the side of the boat and drowning, that's being ocean absorbed, and it's not a particularly good thing, right? So for me, being self-aware is looking at myself and saying, how am I doing? What are my patterns? What are my habits? Am I okay? Am I stressing out too much? Am I taking on too much? And some Christians, and I say this with love because I've been here, where I look at that and go, well, if I spend too much time worried about that, God doesn't want me to do that because that's being selfish. No, that's being self-aware. If I'm drowning in self, meaning that I don't care about anybody else's experience, only mine, that is what God has taught us not to do. We can't drown in self, but we need to be aware of self. So that awareness thing. But the other big thing people tell me that keeps them from dealing with their burnout, and man, if I've heard this once, I've heard it so many times, I can't afford to be burned out right now. And they will then explain to me the things that they must do in order to get to the next stage of life, or to get past this audit, or to get past this thing that's happening, or whatever. And so they'll explain to me, I think you might be right, I might not be doing well, but it doesn't matter because I have to get to XYZ. And what they don't understand is that's like telling me I have to get to where you are, Randy, from where I am. I'm in Kansas, you're in Texas. That's like saying I have a gallon of gas left in my tank, but I have to get to Texas, so I can't afford to think about going to a gas station. Yeah. Well, let's see how that works, right? Because, it's one thing to say I have to get there, but it's another thing to be practical about I don't have enough to get there. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does. And, I think what a lot of that boils down to is, this is American thing. You're far enough in the West that you get this idea of self-reliance, this kind of go get 'em, which, and that's just responsibility and innovation. I'm all for that.
Oh, absolutely.
But it just seems like the idea that without God we can do nothing is one that we pay lip service to, but we don't really live. And I think sometimes God lets us run down that road just so we can realize that, no, legit, we have to learn to depend on Him. I mean, it's easy when you're living in the promised land full of milk and honey to think, oh yeah, I can handle this. But when you're in the desert and there ain't no food and water, you need some manna. You need you need a rock to hit with a rod like Moses did and get some water, because you realize just how empty we are, and that's all. Most people don't want to hear that.
Yes. Oh man, you're singing my song. My dad loves to preach a 4-chapter outline of Jonah. And the 4-chapter outline is: chapter 1 is running away from God, chapter 2 is running back to God, chapter 3 is running with God, and chapter 4 is running ahead of God. And I don't know what that was. And running with God, that's narcotic. I mean, oh my goodness, when you are in the zone and you are taking on life's challenges and you're being successful, that is the best. But what some of us do is we start to run ahead of God. That's why Jonah got burned out and wanted God to just leave a scorched mark on the ground where Nineveh was. It's because we get ahead of what God's trying to do. And I think sometimes even the best, Elijah did this, even God's best servants will run a little bit ahead of what God is asking them to do. And sometimes we have to remember that God is supposed to set the pace, not me. Yeah. Right. I'm supposed to watch where God wants me to be right now, and then I'm supposed to take a step with them. It's not like some pastors I work with have the impression they have to impress God. God's gonna wake up one day and see how far I've gone, and He's gonna be so impressed with me. No, God knows exactly where you are, and God hasn't asked you to run out in front of Him. He's asked you to just walk with Him in that process. Oh yeah, the whole idea that we're human beings, not human doings. Yes, I love that.
All right, I know. Okay, there's another phrase that we hear that you deal with in the book that I want to ask you about, because I've always laughed at this one, and that's the idea. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I'm like, yeah, it can also leave you maimed for life, right?
Right.
You
Right.
know? So
Yeah.
what are you touching on in that one?
It's just profoundly scientifically untrue that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I always say, if you graph that out, because I'm a statistician, right? In psychology, that's what I do. I'm a data analyst. So if you draw that out as a graph, it's like a straight line. The harder I push, the more I stress out, the better the result I'll get, up until you get to this unfortunate point where you die, and then you get no results. So it looks like a straight line. That's not what stress looks like. If we actually plot out what it actually looks like in reality, it looks like a bell curve. So there's a point at which I'm not getting any benefit and I'm not stressing. That is what we would call inefficiency, or even like when you think about somebody in a hospital room who's in a bed for 18 days and their muscles atrophy. We need some stress. We need to push ourselves some. God designed us to be stressed. So as we stress, we get better results, up until we get to this high point in the curve. And now we have gotten to the point where that's the best results we're going to get from pushing harder. And there's nobody to wave a red flag in front of you and say, it's not going to get better after this if you push harder. But none of us know that. And so we keep pushing harder. Now, all of a sudden, we're getting worse results. We're working harder, but we're getting less of what we're going for. And so we're starting to go on that downside of the curve. And here's the challenge. A lot of times when that happens, we think, I just must not be pushing hard enough. So then we push even harder.
Yeah.
That's when burnout happens,
Yeah.
is we're pushing harder and harder, and we're getting worse and worse results. And we start to feel like a failure. And it's like, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm trying my best. I'm doing everything I can, but I'm getting terrible results. And that's when that burnout thing tends to happen. So it isn't true that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Actually, it would be a better, and it's much less beautiful turn of phrase to say what healthily stresses you out will make you stronger. But once stress becomes unhealthy, you'll be weaker, and it doesn't matter in what arena of your life.
Yeah, that doesn't fit in a Kelly Clarkson song quite as nicely.
No, it doesn't.
But,
It doesn't. No.
I think that's right. Okay, so on your website, by the way, this is what it looks like. It's stressfracturebook.com. You say your ultimate guide to beating burnout, right? Subtitle of the book.
It's kind of an audacious subtitle. I didn't write that, by the way.
No.
So I feel like that's a little arrogance. Your ultimate guide.
Well, okay. So, okay. Aside from the marketing aspect of the word ultimate, here's the question. Because this is, I think, for a lot of people, the frustrating point. They've been beaten by burnout.
Yes.
And you're suggesting that this can be turned around. There is hope.
Absolutely.
You can beat the burnout. And I know what the human tendency is go, yeah, okay, I'm glad it worked for that guy, but it would never work for me. But you're saying that you actually can turn this around.
Oh, absolutely. And that's probably the most important thing I can tell a person who's feeling burnout right now, who's watching this, that going through burnout will leave you feeling discouraged, and it will leave you feeling like a failure, and you won't think you can get back to your normal self. And if you're sitting here listening to this and you're thinking, I can't get back to my normal self, I'm telling you, you have to trust me on this. That's normal, but it's untrue. You can get back. As a matter of fact, you're going to be better than you were before, because what this is going to do, my friend Henry Cloud and also John Townsend, they talk about necessary crises. And this is a necessary crisis. The fact that you're in burnout happened because what you were doing was unsustainable. It has forced you now to look at what sustainable success looks like for you. Now, I want you to think about that curve I was just talking about. So you pushed harder and harder and harder, and at a certain point, you started getting worse and worse results. So actually, making the decisions that you need to make right now to get healthy, by definition, are going to start bringing the results back. If we can start to make good decisions, you're going to not have to push as hard. You're not going to be as exhausted as you are right now, but you're going to start getting better results. You're going to start to feel like, hey, I'm getting my life back again. So not only is it possible, this is what I believe. I believe that on the other side of burnout, if you make healthy choices, I believe that you will be in a renaissance, a new season of your life that is healthier and more productive than ever before. And I saw that happen with my dad. There is nobody that I know of that is close to my dad that you will talk to who would not tell you that he has been better over the last 14 years than they've ever known him to be before. So it is a trial of fire that you're going through. And so fire doesn't feel good to walk through it. But what it will do is it will refine your decisions in life, and it will cause you to be at a crossroads of, am I going to make some healthy choices? And if you do make those healthy choices, you're going to get your life back in an even better way.
Yeah, and if you are walking through the fire, I can promise you this, you don't want to walk alone. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, without that fourth man in the fire, would have just burned up, and you don't need to do that if you're there. All right, Dr. Hoover, tell me real quickly, you mentioned that you have a podcast out there if people want to follow up with you and go in a little deeper.
Yeah, so we just started. If you go to YouTube and look up the Dr. Jonathan Hoover Show, or any of the places where you get audio podcasts, I do a format where everything is about the intersection of Christianity and psychology. And every other week I interview a guest, and then on the off weeks I do a little solo talk on a specific psychology-related topic. And so I'd love to have you check that out.
Go get healthy, people. And if you're feeling like, seriously, if you're feeling like you're done, you're never going to get, like Dr. Hoover says, back to yourself, just hear this. If you don't hear anything out of this, you can. That's the beautiful thing about approaching from a body, mind, and spirit process, because God is a God of redemption, of restoration. The brokenness that he can work with is the kind where he puts you back together, not the kind where you're ruined. That kind is not what God wants for you. Appreciate you guys being here. If you know someone that needs to hear this, hit that share button. And if you haven't liked, follow, or subscribe, do that. And we'll see you next time here on Life Today Live.